The town of Ashton was a quiet place, nestled between dense forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where secrets were whispered behind closed doors, and where nothing ever really happened, or so everyone thought. But beneath its peaceful surface, something dark had been brewing for years, waiting for the right moment to erupt. That moment came on a cold October night. I was closing up at the bar I owned on Main Street. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, and the last of the regulars had staggered out hours ago. The night was unusually silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I locked the door and turned off the lights, leaving only the dim glow of the streetlights outside to guide my way. As I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. The street was empty, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But the feeling persisted, an oppressive weight that settled in my chest. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys in my nervousness, and just as I managed to unlock the door, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was like a whisper, carried on the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. I froze, straining to hear it again, but there was nothing. Just the quiet night and the distant hum of the town. Shaking my head, I told myself it was nothing. Just the paranoia of being alone at night, that's all. I got into the car, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot. The feeling didn't go away, though. If anything, it grew stronger as I drove through the empty streets, the shadows seeming to stretch out and reach for me as I passed. I lived on the outskirts of town, in a small house surrounded by trees. As I pulled into my driveway, the headlights of the car illuminated the dense woods that bordered my property. The shadows between the trees were impenetrable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, hidden in the darkness. I parked the car and hurried inside, locking the door behind me with a sense of relief. The house was quiet, the silence only broken by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I turned on the lights, trying to banish the unease that clung to me, but the shadows seemed to press closer, just beyond the reach of the light. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, something I hadn't done in years. Ashton was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked at night, trusting in the safety of familiarity. But tonight felt different. Tonight there was something out there. I settled into my chair in the living room, trying to calm my racing heart. The television flickered to life, the sound filling the room and pushing back the oppressive silence. But as I sat there, staring at the screen without really seeing it, I realized that the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer, and walked to the window. The night outside was dark, the trees standing like silent sentinels against the sky. I peered into the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. Just the wind in the trees, the occasional rustle of leaves. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it, 3 figures, standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the gloom. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at them, trying to make out any details. They were tall, unnaturally so, their forms distorted by the darkness. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. They were real, and they were watching me. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911. The line rang and rang, but no one picked up. The fear that had been gnawing at me all night finally exploded into full-blown terror. I was alone, and there was no one coming to help me. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight, and backed away from the window, keeping my eyes on the dark figures outside. They hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but I knew they were getting closer. I could feel it. I turned off the lights, hoping the darkness would hide me. The house was plunged into blackness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I could barely see, but I didn't dare turn the lights back on. I crouched in the corner of the living room, flashlight gripped tightly in my hand, my eyes fixed on the window. Minutes passed, each one stretching out into an eternity. The figures outside remained motionless, their presence a constant weight on my mind. I tried to think of what to do, how to escape, but my thoughts were jumbled, the fear clouding my mind. And then, without warning, they moved. The three figures stepped out from the tree line, moving in unison, their movements slow and deliberate. They were coming closer, their forms becoming clearer in the dim light. They were tall, their limbs elongated and unnaturally thin, their faces hidden in shadow. There was something wrong about them, something that set every nerve in my body on edge. I backed further into the corner, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figures were almost at the edge of my yard now, their movements slow but relentless. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. But where could I go? They were outside, and the woods surrounded my house. I was trapped, with nowhere to hide. As they reached the edge of the yard, they stopped again, their heads turning towards the house, towards me. It was as if they knew I was watching, as if they could see me through the darkness. And then, one of them raised a hand. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled with a terrifying sense of purpose. The figure pointed directly at me, its elongated fingers almost touching the window pane. A cold dread filled me, and I felt like I was drowning in fear. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up and ran to the back door, throwing it open and plunging into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I stumbled forward, the flashlight bobbing in my hand. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get away from them, to escape their gaze. I ran into the woods, branches scratching at my face and arms as I pushed through the underbrush. The flashlight's beam bounced wildly, casting grotesque shadows all around me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel them behind me, their presence like a dark cloud that pressed down on me, suffocating me with fear. I didn't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the forest around me becoming a twisted labyrinth of trees and shadows. The cold night air burned in my lungs, and my legs felt like lead. But I couldn't stop. I knew that if I stopped, they would catch me. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing, the trees opening up to reveal a patch of open sky. The moon was high overhead, casting an eerie silver light over the scene. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. For a moment, I thought I had lost them. The woods were silent, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the wind. But then I saw them, emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing, their forms dark and menacing. They had followed me. I tried to stand, to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was too exhausted, too drained. All I could do was watch as they approached, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they knew there was no need to hurry. As they came closer, I could finally see them clearly in the moonlight. They were human, or at least they had been once. Their faces were pale, almost ghostly, their eyes dark pits that seemed to absorb the light. Their bodies were twisted, elongated, their limbs too long, their fingers like claws. But it was their eyes that terrified me the most. There was something in those eyes, something ancient and malevolent. These were not ordinary killers. They were something far worse. Something that had been hiding in the shadows of Ashton for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, they had found me. The tallest of the three stepped forward, its eyes locked onto mine. It was almost close enough to touch now, its breath cold on my face. I could see the faint outline of a smile on its lips, a cruel, mocking smile that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew there was no escape. I had run as far as I could, and now they had me cornered. There was nothing left to do but face them, to confront the darkness that had been stalking me all night. With the last of my strength, I raised the flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the darkness and illuminating the figure in front of me. For a brief moment, with the last of my strength, I raised the flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the darkness and illuminating the figure in front of me. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation in its eyes, as if the light had disturbed something deep within it. But then the moment passed, and the figure stepped forward, its twisted smile widening, The light seemed to have no effect on them. These were not creatures of flesh and blood that could be warded off by something as simple as a beam of light. They were something else, something far older and more dangerous. I could feel my body shutting down, the exhaustion and fear finally taking their toll. My vision blurred, the edges darkening as I struggled to stay conscious. The figures loomed over me now, their presence suffocating, their eyes boring into me with a malevolent intensity. And then, just as I was about to give in to the darkness, I heard it, a voice, soft and distant, calling my name. I turned my head, my vision swimming, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, her face obscured by the shadows, but her presence felt warm, almost comforting. She held something in her hand, a small object that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The figures around me seemed to hesitate, their focus shifting from me to the woman. For the first time that night, I felt a glimmer of hope. The woman stepped forward, holding out the glowing object, a small, intricately carved stone. The light from the stone seemed to repel the figures, pushing them back towards the edge of the clearing. They hissed and snarled, their twisted forms retreating into the shadows. With a final, hateful glare, the figures melted into the darkness, disappearing as suddenly as they had appeared. The clearing was silent once more, the oppressive weight lifted from the air. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking with relief. The woman approached, her face still hidden in the shadows, and knelt beside me. She placed the glowing stone in my hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. "You're safe now," she said, her voice soft and calming. "They won't bother you again." I wanted to ask her who she was, what those things were, but the exhaustion was too much. My eyes closed, the darkness finally overtaking me. When I woke up, I was lying in my own bed, the morning light streaming through the window. The events of the previous night felt like a distant nightmare, but the small stone on my bedside table reminded me that it had been all too real. The town of Ashton never spoke of what happened that night. The bar patrons who had gone missing were written off as lost to the elements or victims of accidents, but I knew better. I never saw the woman again, but I kept the stone with me at all times, a reminder of the night I faced the killer trio and lived to tell the tale. As for the trio, I could still feel them out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. But I knew one thing for sure: I was no longer afraid of the dark. I had faced the monsters that hid in the night, and I had survived. And as long as I had that stone, they would never come for me again.